Okay, so welcome and thank you for having this opportunity to present my ideas on the connection between problem solving and paradigm shifts. The goal of this talk is actually to show how strongly problem solving and paradigm changes are connected, and actually how this is also strongly related to expertise. The perspective I take in here is the perspective of logic. I've been having a presentation some time ago in 2008 in here on Goldratt's thinking processes, and that's actually the starting point of this presentation. Maybe shortly, for those that do not know me, my background. So essentially, I'm a physicist, but I never worked as a physicist. I have been working since I left my studies in industry, mainly in the area of currently consultancy and interim management in the area of innovation. Companies that I have been working with mainly in Belgium, or Verhaat, that was a company that was providing as a service innovative product development to other companies, companies that wanted to have a new product developed within a certain price. I developed in that company space activities also. I led that company as a CEO. It had about 100 to 150 persons. And I've also been, since 2002, doing consultancy and interim management to companies like InnoGenetics, Barco, InBev, Owens Corning, mostly in the area of complex project management, business development, and innovative product development. Since my period at Verhaat, where I was the CEO, had so many challenges to tackle, both technical, managerial, cost-wise, cash flow, that actually I noticed some recurring patterns in any of these problematic situations. Actually, it was always the same behavior coming up, assumptions that turned out to be wrong, assumptions that people were working on, whether it's in product development or in cash flow management or in whatever. And so I became interested, and that's when I created this company, Non-Zero Ratio, in order to combine research on problem solving with consultancy and interim management in an area where there's a lot of uncertainty, exploration. I would say, if you look to business from this exploration point of view, then I was essentially working in this exploration area. So the starting point, as I indicated, is actually Goldratt's thinking processes, which I learned to know during these business activities. He's also a physicist. His processes are actually not very well known. They're also rarely used, I would say. I've indicated use of externalized logic is exceptional. Giving an example from Clément's book, because you've adopted it actually to explain how you're thinking. But essentially, I would say, I take it as a starting point, but the starting point is not obvious at all. Because essentially what Goldratt's thinking processes are doing, I compare it to calculating in your head. If you have to multiply 3 to 1 by 1 to 3 out of your head, you will have a difficulty in doing that. If you can do it by hand, then it goes easy. Doing it by hand is a kind of an externalization of the internal processes that require less load on one hand on yourself, but also that allow verification and allow sharing verification by others. You have to see Goldratt's thinking process as exactly the same. The way you are thinking, it's always a cause and effect based thinking, but you're always doing it either internally or writing it out in complete phrases so that the logic, it's also, the connections are also not clear. And what is rarely being done is actually to use it to confront, to challenge your own thinking for yourself, or to allow others to challenge your thinking. So I take it as a starting point, but I realize that it's not at all a standard way, not even within science. I think Clément is currently made, it's the only one that I know that has actually mapped the logic thinking of these processes. They have been developed for business, and in business solutions, they have really helped to find breakthrough solutions. Breakthrough solutions both in innovation. For instance, how I have been using these in innovation is just by understanding when you want to develop a new product, then you just ask yourself what are the undesired effects that my product is causing with the customer. So the customer is buying a product, some features he's not pleased about, so why is that? You try to map the logic behind that, and then when you have mapped this logic, why you are causing this undesired effect in your product to the customer, you can try to understand also better how you can avoid it. So that's more or less the way that it works. So taking it as a starting point, I have been realizing also that it has some flaws, and that's what I indicate with when logic breaks down. Essentially, the Goldratt thinking processes, they look for what they call in their local jargon an injection. What is an injection? It's very simple. It's actually in your cause and effect logic, it's looking for an assumption. So if you understand your logic of cause and effect as starting points leading to some conclusion, then ultimately when what you are not questioning in your normal logic is the assumptions behind. You're taking them as a starting point. You can consider these starting points from a mathematical way like your boundary conditions. If you're solving 4 equations, actually the boundary conditions are the starting equations you're taking with. You're just taking them for granted, and from there on you're trying to develop solutions, but they define actually your solution space. So these are the assumptions, and Goldratt's conviction was that by mapping your logic, you can really better identify the assumptions you're making, and then you can start questioning your assumptions. And whenever you do that, and you find an assumption that you consider it's actually doubtful that it's always right, you may have found a solution to your problem. You may have found a way to avoid the undesirable effect or solve the problem. So that's the process behind. But the interesting thing is that this process, although it may sound, it's pure logic, it also has a boundary where the process itself breaks down. And that's actually what I wanted to indicate in here in this presentation. So the baseline of this approach, of this logic approach, which is, Goldratt calls it, and I agree with him, it's actually reflecting the scientific process. It's the way that science is working by thinking logically and by making an assumption, questioning it. He is also presenting a method to check assumptions, which is, if an assumption is right, you should also try to see if out of this assumption you can predict other effects. So this is what he calls effect, cause, effect. If you're proposing a new cause and you want to be sure whether this cause is really true, you're becoming wet because it's raining outside, you may become wet for other reasons, you just try to predict another effect if that cause is true, to check, and if you have 2 unrelated effects which are true, then you have increased the probability that your cause is also true. So it's actually kind of a tool that is reflecting the scientific method. What happens if you try to do this for yourself by externalizing this? I think I would expect Clément to be able to confirm that. It's not that easy. It looks very easy, but once you start mapping your logic, you find actually that you really make what Goldratt calls transatlantic connections. You really jump from one element to another one, and you're actually making a lot of assumptions behind that you were not aware of. So it's not that straightforward to apply it, but by doing it, you're actually scrutinizing your own thinking. I would say it helps you in realizing some mistakes you were making, some assumptions you are making, but it's a helpful tool. When you're applying with 2 persons or more persons, then actually the tool helps you to really pinpoint the disagreements. You just expose how you are thinking, you show to somebody else, and the person says, no, no, I disagree with you because here you have assumed that, and that's not always true. So it helps actually to integrate knowledge by applying it with 2 or more persons. The interesting is what happens when many persons are applying, and then what from my point of view, is the interesting element where logic breaks down, is that if you would develop the logic about the challenge or a problem with a large group of people, then you would find out that some of the assumptions are really not challenged. They are completely agreed by the entire group. And these challenges, these are the ones that I claim reflect a boundary of how well one can apply logic thinking. They are actually what one could call the norms or the shared paradigms. These are the ones that remain unchallenged, and it's there that I claim there's a huge opportunity. One of the injections, to use Goldblatt's logic, that I'm claiming to say logic breaks down at this level, is that there is a kind of, in psychology, call it bystander behavior. I thought just to use it because I think it makes the concept simple, but there is the effect in psychology that they say if a person is in need, that actually, and a group of people is seeing it, that with the more you are, the less likely it is that somebody will stand up and help the person. And in this situation, it has been argued that there are a number of reasons why this is happening. One of them is that one is looking to each other, so there is a kind of a doubt, and if nobody is moving, one also is not moving. Also, you want not to look foolish by doing something. And also, it's not clear who is actually responsible. We will come back later with the example I'm giving, but I claim that actually when you're touching paradigms in the logic, when you have developed an understanding of a problem which is shared by an entire group, and when you look to the shared assumptions, these paradigms, then I claim that actually because of the same phenomena, there will be less urge to challenge these assumptions, because they are shared so much and nobody feels responsible, and how can everybody be wrong? How could this be wrong? This is a kind of phenomena that leads to the fact that people will rather exploit than explore paradigm changes. So there is a kind of a huge opportunity, in my view, by just putting more energy into that direction, and that's what I, at the end of this presentation, want to show with this example. Secondly, and it's a bit related, also there have been over the last, let's say, 40 years, a lot of interesting studies on cognitive psychology, exposing a number of thinking errors that as individuals we are all subject to. I actually claim that all these errors at the level of paradigm changes and norms, they all are also playing at the group level. So there's a kind of a groupthink around paradigm and the norms, and this causes several of the cognitive errors that have been identified with the individuals also to occur at the group level. I gave in here some of the examples, but later on, with a specific case on the placebo paper, I think it will become more clear how this, why this is the case. I think, I assume most of you are familiar with the mistakes that have been identified here, like error of omission, that is forgetting to take something into account, or fundamental attribution error. It's actually attributing wrongly to something, or availability bias, using something that appears correlated as a causal effect, while it is not the case. And we will see how all of these mistakes actually appear to be more likely to happen when one is tackling paradigm changes. So this is, I would say, one main reason why logic breaks down, because logic, ultimately, it's about sharing an understanding, and once the sharing is sufficiently robust over a larger group, then I claim, because of these mechanisms, that the paradigm changes will be insufficiently scrutinized, creating a certain blindness. So actually what I'm saying is that the paradigm change that Thomas Kuhn wrote about in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it's still there today. This is one area where logic breaks down, just by the extrapolation to the larger group. So they are not challenged, and it's a huge opportunity. There is also a second reason why logic breaks down. I've phrased it like problem solving is like a bingo game. To make it a little bit more clear, what I mean with it is when you're playing this game, I don't know if you're familiar with the game, but somehow you have a ball rolling from the top to the bottom, and you have a number of holes that it can get into. Then intuitively you will understand that it's quite tough to have a ball reaching actually the bottom of the game. That's where you have the high scores. And what I'm using this picture for is just to indicate that whenever you're doing kind of a problem solving or a challenge or an innovation, what happens is that you tend to stick to your first idea, and it's a kind of an anchoring. It's what I call a partial solution. You come to the first thing, it's not the optimal thing, and from there on, I claim that you come to different types of solutions. I refer to this perspective as the segmentation theory, and I think this is the second major reason why problem solving, I would say, in a kind of a global brain context, is hampered significantly, and why it needs to be overcome. So what do I mean with this segmentation theory? It's actually the perception that, or the observation that solutions tend to develop around a seed idea, a kind of a core concept that appears to be worthy for further development, and this then becomes development. But this seed idea is just one idea, and there can be several good ideas, different ways to tackle a problem. I would call this like a solution can have different dimensions, and one seed is addressing one dimension, another seed is addressing another dimension, but nobody is immediately from the starting point addressing all the dimensions. As examples on how to view these segmentations, I call these segmentations, they're like partial solutions, really in a mathematical sense. They serve a goal, but not completely, only partially, and partially implying locally or temporarily or for a certain type of application. Examples are languages. We have a multitude of languages. They all work in a certain area, but they don't work elsewhere. So these are segments. They are partial solutions. Political parties, the same thing. You have socialist parties, labor parties. They all have a kind of a seed around which they develop, and they are segments. Once you take this approach, actually I use this approach in product innovation, because in product innovation you can easily use it as a benchmark. You just imagine different ways or different types of products, like in mobility, cars, trains, etc. And then you can actually, through the benchmarking, identify the different dimensions of a solution. So you have to see these segments as partial solutions. And what happens with these partial solutions is that at some point they apparently start to compete with each other. I like to take the example of language. Language, it's something that came about incidentally, and several languages have developed just because people were moving around and split in groups, and then the mobility was not of that nature like today that they would mix again. So groups split geographically, and you had different languages being developed. Today you can say that because of the mobility, languages are competing. Examples, at the European Community level, they have to decide the number of languages that they will allow officially, in which all the papers need to be translated, etc. Political parties today, they are really competing. While one could say in the past that they had a clear group to which they were addressing, and they grew or developed themselves. So the essential point in here is that segments at some point have a seed from which they grow and they develop, but at another point segments start to compete, and that's where a problem is created that limits the problem-solving ability, that limits the ability to apply what I would say Goldratt's thinking processes. And essentially, this is because at some point, because of this competition that is coming around, there is a focus on the self and on the survival rather than on the evolution, and this reduces the ability to grow. Why is this? Actually, I claim that this leads, on one hand, to unnecessary complexity of the solutions. So this fact that they become competitors, segments become competitors, this creates additional complexity, and it also inhibits the further evolution. For instance, symptoms that you will find everywhere in segments is that they start blaming the other segments, and because of this competition. And that they start optimizing themselves, they start also strengthening the structure and the hierarchy within the segment in order to be better placed for self-defense. I claim this, on the other hand, this provides, again, a huge opportunity, because the fact that logic is inhibited, I just take the example of political parties. They have some starting assumption. If you just apply the logic thinking, then you have to look for the assumptions and start to question them. Well, it's clear in any segment there will be assumptions that you are not allowed to challenge, because these are the assumptions that are considered to be the core of the segment. So there are taboos. Taboo is actually a demonstration of a segmentation and of a way to protect oneself against the competition of the other segments. There is, however, a way to overcome this. I think I also briefly presented this in 2008. One is actually to construct what I call the ideal solution. And the other one is to add what I call the eclipse step to the thinking processes. I just explained the concept briefly with three different types of segmentations. The solution or the analysis on transport. What you can actually do, and segmentation in this case helps you to do this analysis. If you don't have segments, you cannot provide the analysis. But whenever you have a segment, you just can ask yourself for any segmentation, like in mobility, I've just taken here two solutions in mobility that are currently clearly competing with each other. One is the transport over road, like cars and trucks, and the other one is the transport over rails, like trains. What you do as a mathematical exercise, you just say mathematically these are partial solutions. I look into what is the seed, the attractive element of each of the solutions. And actually you can already easily predict that the seed of the attractive solution will be something that is missing in the other segments. That's why the other segments have actually also found the seed onto which they have developed. If you do this just for cars and trains, it's very easy. You need not be an expert in mobility. Everybody can do this process. You can identify that the car has the advantage that you can actually start taking off at any time from any place. So this is the advantage, and this is not offered. It's a disadvantage of the train, because the train doesn't come to your home, and also it's at a fixed time. On the other hand, the advantage of the train is that actually you need not be able to drive. So if you're blind or if you have drunk, you can still take the train. Also, you can still do work. So you can actually do a lot of things while traveling by train that you cannot accomplish by car. So what is the ideal solution process telling you? It's just telling you that the ideal solution is a construct which is the integration of all these solutions. So all these partial solutions, all these partial dimensions, you integrate them, and you just, by definition, you say, I want to have all the advantages, and I don't want to have any of the disadvantages. This is actually what I would call the development of a vision in the future, which is today not achieved, but which any of the segments should not have any problem with. I mean, it's something that if it would exist, everybody would agree that this is the best solution. Why is this the case? Because what you're actually doing is taking all of the advantages. And in here I've just used the car and the train, but to be complete in this assessment, you should also add the bicycle. You should also add the airplane. And so this is a construct that the more segments you have, the more complete your understanding becomes of what the ideal solution would be like. And this is a kind of a driver that from today onwards you should build a consensus. This is the goal we have to target to, but intrinsically it assumes that any of these segments is aware of the fact that it needs to evolve to this future. Now, the key question is how do you identify this path from today to the future? And this is something that you address by looking into what are today's core problems. And today one could say that there is a real tug of war between the car and the train. There is less of a tug of war between the bicycle and the car, for instance. But these two are really competing. You can see it, for instance, if one lobby group, and this is what I call the structure within the segment that tries to defend itself, if one group is actually claiming that there should be more highways in order to minimize the traffic jams around Brussels or around Antwerp, then it's clear that the public transport, the train sector will say, oh no, this is the wrong direction. We should actually more promote public transport rather than stimulate going by car. So this is a tug of war going on that is preventing the investments or decisions by politicians taking place, because it's not clear what way to go. You have to look to pain points today, and you should do this from this ideal solution. And if you look to this ideal solution in this assessment, then I think it's quite obvious that you should evolve the solution that combines these two. It's an automated transport, like a Google car, something like that, an automated transport. That's the ideal solution. The question is, how can you get there today? The solution that I arrived at by applying this analysis, and this is a kind of a crazy solution, but this is generic with these processes, is that actually today, if you could equip all the cars with an automated cruise control, then all the cars in bottleneck points, they would be able to behave like a train. And this is something which shows how this concept works. You have different segments, you construct the ideal solution, you will have to mix all the properties. This implies that actually in bottleneck points, cars should behave like trains. Now, today, nobody is thinking of changing in 1 year time also existing cars to have this equipment, but I claim that from this perspective, one would be able to immediately, dramatically reduce the number of accidents, because you're going to automatic, if you come into a bottleneck point and you switch on your cruise control, which is also able to activate your brakes, then you don't need to be attentive, which is a flawed assumption that is being made currently with drivers, that they're always paying attention. You also reduce the reaction time, which is a key element in traffic jams, why the flow through bottleneck points is much less. And it's also clear that to do this, you would have to modify your infrastructure. Meaning that if you know the area on the Kennedy Tunnel in Antwerp, you have traffic to the direction of Netherlands that is coming in from the left, and that just after the Kennedy Tunnel has the ability to quit to the right, this is crossing the traffic. It's clear, if you imagine cars like trains of 10 kilometers long, you cannot have any crossing anymore. So what this implies is actually that in order to solve the mobility problem, you should, on one hand, create at a higher level a structure in which all the stakeholders are present. In this case, the stakeholders for road traffic and the stakeholders for train traffic. And actually they have to agree that all of them will have to involve to this automatic transport. And from there on, they have much more ability to make decisions like, in a first step, equip every car with an automated cruise control. In a second step, one could imagine that the instance like the train organization, I don't know the English word, the NMBS, that they start buying Google cars rather than buying trains, because they start to invest in this, and you actually provide new potential, new ideas that are currently not explored. This is an example of how this segmentation works, but also showing why in today's structures, today's segmented approach, it cannot work, because every segment is working on an isolated element, and nobody is actually developing this vision of the future and working backwards, implying identifying the ideal solution, and then from there on working backwards to identify what today ideally could be done. And of course, I'm just making suggestions here, but the key point is that there should be a platform to have these discussions, reasoning backwards and then seeing what would today be the best option. Same with languages. Maybe this is a bit too small to read, but with languages, you can also indicate that today they are in competition, as I explained. There have been trials in the past to overcome this problem, for instance by proposing Esperanto. And there is an alternative approach from segmentation theory. I came into this view because of applying another tool from Goldratt, which is a contradiction tree. It's an evaporating cloud. Whenever you have two people disagreeing and they don't come to an agreement, and they are both considered to be intelligent, then it starts to become interesting to explore what they are agreeing about. This is again looking for the shared assumption, which may be a norm. And when I applied this in the Dutch to this discussion, the famous discussion of early 2000s, whether pannenkoek should become pannenkoek, but for sure you have these same discussions in other languages, then it's very interesting. On one hand, you can imagine scientists defending the cause and effect, why it should remain pannenkoek. You have another group of scientists which are saying why it should be changed to pannenkoek. And then you have the non-expert discourses in here, which starts exploring because of the increased complexity. But could it not be that there is a paradigm shift needed? So what is the framework within which they are thinking? And then what you see is that there is one thing that they are both not questioning, which is a shared norm, which is that there should be only one way to write the word. And this is what is typically the process of going from normal thinking to questioning it, which is abnormal, or which actually by definition abnormal, it's the same as absurd. And so it's not done. People today in language are not actually questioning it. We all are being educated. There's only one way, and you have to apply or to learn the right way to write. Now, The process in Goldbach's thinking process is that you actually identify this norm, and you ask yourself the question: really, is that really needed? That needs to be one way to write the word. And when you reflect about this more deeply, then you recognize that this is not the case. That actually the purpose of language, of written language, should be to be able to communicate a message, and the language should actually be as simple as possible, have as few rules as possible, so that it can be learned with as minimum energy as possible by other people. So essentially, you could, from this framework, identify that the ideal language should actually be shared by the entire world and should have a very minimum set of rules. Now, identifying this norm, you can easily see that the discussion about Pannenkoek and Pannenkoek, actually it's another real discussion, because the message is clear. Everybody knows what is the topic about. There is no question about it. But also it makes clear that a lot of other rules in the Dutch language actually do not contribute to making the message more clear. Whether it's Pannenkoek or Pannenkoek, but even so-called DT errors, they don't contribute to the message. Everybody knows what's being written. So you can actually identify there's a complete set of rules that is not serving the goal of protecting the message. Out of this, this is one part of the analysis. The other part of the analysis is just looking to the segmentation of today's world in terms of languages. You can see that there are really a lot of languages. And these languages, the language experts have to be fair, they have grown incidentally. They are just what in French would be said an accident de parcours. It's just because of people migrating, splitting, and then therefore causing languages to develop autonomously further and further splitting, etc. So it's just incidental that this has taken place. And today, we are actually seeing more and more the disadvantages of this, because we are all traveling more and more worldwide, so we are more and more confronted with regions where they speak other languages, and we are going to be more and more seeing of these undesirable effects, because mobility will further increase. So from this perspective point of view, rather than to go for an Esperanto approach, this segmentation approach would do something differently. It would look to, again, the ideal solution of language, which is to have a single language shared by the entire world, and then look into how to get there with the minimum of effort from today. And then from this perspective, you can actually see that, for instance, if you compare French and Dutch, in Dutch we don't make the distinction between a male and a female of a word. Both are de. And in French, you have the rule le and la. And what you see is that a lot of people, not the Frenchmen, but a lot of foreigners that have to learn the language, they are struggling, whether it's le maison or la maison, they are struggling with this. While from the segmentation approach, you could conclude that, as in Dutch, we don't need to distinguish between male and female, and so in French, they also should not distinguish. And so therefore, you come into an interesting exercise where you can suddenly see all these languages like a kind of a benchmark, and you can play out these languages against each other just to see how you can minimize the rules. And this means that in any language, like in Dutch, you can forget about DT, etc. In any language, you can actually go for simplification. Any language, all the languages have a set of rules which do not contribute to protecting the message, but which are being put in hold by the structure that is actually also in charge of protecting the language against distinction. And this gives a completely different view again. It would also give a completely different role to the language experts, because suddenly it could become a challenge to reverse engineer the development of languages. Languages have evolved, which implies that actually they have certain commonalities, and you could actually, on one hand, simplify every language, and on the other hand, you could take into account the relations to actually evolve back language languages because of similarities. Like German and Dutch, they are quite similar, and it's imaginable that experts just evolve back while simplifying. These are types of concepts I just use to explain how segmentation allows you to develop an understanding of what should be ideally reached, and how then, out of this ideal understanding, you can see that today there are a lot of disadvantages. For instance, today one could say that all these rules about DT, they take up energy in schools because people have to learn about these rules while they don't contribute, and on the contrary, half of the people today are discriminated because it's only the more capable ones that are able to apply these rules that are not discriminated. It's still a common way to discriminate people that don't know all the rules when they're making a writing error, when soliciting for a job, for instance. So one could say that these sets of rules which do not protect the message are also a kind of a loss of energy wasted in an area which is not really contributing, of which you cannot pinpoint what is the real raison d'être, other than for historical reasons, which is the main reason why language experts will still defend these rules. And this is a way to show also why Esperanto is less successful, because Esperanto is requiring that everybody should learn a new language, while in this approach you actually take less energy. You're releasing energy by just within any language removing rules which can be considered as not really contributing. Please.
But it also costs energy to unlearn those rules, right? I would probably find it pretty difficult to unlearn the rules I've learned.
Yes, but it's omitting rules. It's also, you have to see today education, when you have kids going to school, they have to learn a lot of rules that energy is being put in. So one could even say it's not really necessary for the current generation to unlearn, but it's more important to stop learning and imposing these rules.
Yeah, I would find it very difficult to decide which rules are of benefit and which are not. I think there's a lot of complexity behind those assumptions here. So.
Yes, that's right, and that's why, and this is inherent in all of these solutions. It's the same with the mobility approach, when I'm saying, look, you should coordinate infrastructure changes of highways with modifications on the entire car park. This can only be done. Actually, what happens is that the experts in these segments, they take up a new role, but they have to take up with their current knowledge. They are best placed in the language experts. Language experts are best placed. We cannot do this. It's not our role, but they are best placed to actually see what types of rules could and should be abandoned. So it's not that this is something which is simple. It's not. It's complex. It's just indicating a point of view that outlines an ideal solution, which is new, because the new solution is not derived. With the segmentation approach, whenever you see different solutions, you can apply it yourself, just to build up a picture of this ideal. And you have to be aware, and this is the implication, that you have to evolve. And then it's indeed a complex question of how to evolve.
Yeah, I get the point of how you could evolve to an ideal solution, but I don't think language is a good example. I think it's just too complex. And I mean, what is a language expert? Linguistic?
Well, I would say the language expert, today you have a committee that is actually controlling the rules.
Okay, yeah.
And this is what I imply. Any segment has a kind of a committee which is putting up the policies, and it's that committee that is not managing in terms of evolution towards the ideal, but it is managing in terms of protecting the segment. And I would say that is the key point. I would say that is, from a global brain point of view, this is what is limiting evolution. The segmentation that is considering other segments as competitors, and that is leading to a loss of energy. And I agree that the other path is not simple, but I think, what I do think is that the process allows you to make clear why these segments are actually working against progress. And it's also making clear, because of the complexity, that these experts, when they realize this evolution is needed, and they get the mandatory, they get this right, and I come back to that with political parties because it's even more complex over there. When they target this ideal solution as a common sense because it combines all the advantages, then you're best placed to find the best way from today to that point. In the case of rules, there may be debates between the French experts and the Dutch experts, or between the Dutch and the German, just to see what sets of rules should be abandoned. So it's a completely different picture, and it's an exploration, but it's an exploration which today is not happening.
Yeah, and I think languages, the evolution of language is much more complex. So I think the idea of segmentation is not well focused on language, on the development of language.
Well, I would say I don't distinguish between language or cars and trains. They are just partial solutions. So I really look at it mathematically, and I also look at it mathematically. I see that once a segment starts zero-sum competition, there is no vision anymore about evolving towards the next step. There is no evolution in the Dutch language. Does not put as an image that look, the language should be spread by as much as large a group as possible, and they are starting to somehow defend themselves when English words are coming in, etc. So the focus is really local. Like cars don't want to stimulate public transport. It's a bit the same. It's really a tug of war. But I think the key point is segmentation as partial solutions, and from there on construct an ideal solution, develop a consensus that we should come to there, and then understand from there that currently there are some, what Goldratt terms, undesirable effects and complexities which are today unnecessary from this ideal solution point of view, and which actually lead to a loss of energy. I would say that's the key point.
But I don't think often there's like not one ideal solution, like often there's like a trade-off that's a bit too simple to say, like you can combine all positive aspects.
Well, Goldratt would say that this is the first obstacle in trying to find solutions. It's the fact if you think there is no solution, you stop
but
searching.
I think they're like, I think sometimes it's just needed that there are like different solutions, that there's like a trade-off, like that if there's something that's good in one aspect, it's automatically good in one aspect.
I agree with that, but I would say that is essentially also the reason why segmentation develops. That's why we have bicycles and cars and trains. So that's right, and that's also why if you would apply this analysis with bicycles, in this case, I would say today it's technically possible to combine through an intelligent cruise control.
Yeah, but the question is also much more complex than just these two aspects.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I would say again the key point is you use it to define your ideal solution, and that's something which is I would say a thought experiment. So it's not a matter of it's feasible or not. You don't have contradictions. The more segments you can add to this, the more complete your ideal solution is specified. The question that you're referring to is that, okay, once we have agreed this, and anybody, you can add even teletransportation to this as a solution, the big question is indeed how to come from today to that ideal solution. And what this makes clear is actually that some things may be possible today, and there may be several things possible today, and you can have a discussion on that. But it's giving you, essentially, I think that is the key point, it's giving you a kind of a framework to think in. What's more important is maybe that some directions are not okay. What in here would clearly be needed is that as long as you don't create a way where public transport and private transport are sitting together to mix up these things, the combined solution will never occur. And what specific next step will be possible as a technical solution, I agree with you, that's again complex. It's like with the languages, what rules to implement or not, it's complex. The key thing is that you first create a vision to work backwards and to say, this is where we need to get, do we all agree? And when we all agree, then you have actually signed that you want to evolve. And without this, you get no evolving.
I don't think necessarily need like one solution. Like it can be that they're like different. Like not everybody needs always to agree. And
I agree, but that's where I indicated that I come back to this claim. It's a zero-sum competition, and zero-sum means that you have win-lose, and that's where it becomes interesting. So you can have different solutions as long as they don't compete. When they start competing, what I'm saying is that because of groupthink, somehow people are not trying anymore to combine this, and that's where the energy gets lost. Well, I have nothing against multiple solutions. On the contrary, actually, like Page has shown mathematically, you have diversity prediction theorem. As long as you don't have the ideal, and in many cases the ideal world doesn't exist, you actually need as much as possible diversity in order to have the best possible outcome.
Well, that already happens with language. It is happening with language. I mean, so I don't get...
Well, I think the point I want to make, but maybe it's not succeeding, is that if you today you're being learned that you have to write in Dutch "Hij wordt met DT" with DT, I claim from this perspective it's a waste of energy, it's discriminating, and the people that are being discriminated, they don't have a voice. So you have this diversity, but you have this competition, you have this structure, and I claim out of this that actually it's just the intellectuals that don't want to question, but speak to anybody that has difficulty, they will just ridicule this type of rules. And this process, it's generic in any segmentation. But maybe I just progress towards the end to make clear the case, because I think essentially I'm strongly challenging you because by definition I'm putting into question norms. And the type of behavior that I have to expect is indeed this is absurd, but this is by definition. A paradigm change is a claim of absurdity. You're questioning something like there is one rule to write something. This is the norm today, and you're questioning this norm, the norm that we have all been entrenched in our studies, that is being imposed by a group of experts and through an entire education system, and you're putting this into question. By definition, this is abnormal, and we associate with this absurd. And so...
But it's an assumption we're making. I think it's an assumption.
What is the assumption?
Well, whether or not you're questioning a norm.
I think it's a norm by definition. I mean, there's a comity of language that states that there is... you have to, they decide de facto it's pannenkoek or pannenkoek. They decide, hey, what is with DT? There's only one way to write. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that out of this analysis, I come to an insight that I did not have before. And before, actually, I considered it very important also with my kids that they were writing the right way. And because of this assessment, now I'm really convinced that it's a kind of intellectual discrimination. Because the rule, it's not protecting the message. And it's this type of process, the way to detect the rule. I came to detect this rule just because of the contradiction, pannenkoek, pannenkoek. Yeah. The way to detect the rule and then to look outwards, which I call the eclipse process, and then to find out actually and to realize that indeed it's not clear. Language is very robust. You can make a lot of writing errors. There are these jokes on the internet where they're just scrambling all the letters, keeping the first and the last letter of a word, and you can still read what's being written. So language is very robust, but somehow this is a rule which is being imposed by a structure. But I compare it to the same set of rules like political parties that say you are not allowed to cooperate with other parties. So there are a lot of rules, and what I claim is that these rules, they somehow are caused by segmentation and a kind of a protectionism. And they inhibit evolution towards an energetically more adapted solution. The last example, political parties. Actually, it's even more complicated because in political parties, you can imagine, as I gave the example, socialist, liberal, you can imagine that the way they logically think, they have to protect themselves and not challenge everything. They have certain beliefs that they consider that people from their party should adopt. And this in itself creates also a huge, I would say, exploitation conflict, because when a strong leader that is aware that they need to evolve, and I'm sure any politician that is leading a party knows that the party has to evolve, when they want to evolve, they need to explore. This means that they need to propose new ways of thinking, of challenging. While they are being elected, they get their power by people from the operations area, by people that choose the politician because the politician thinks like the person is thinking. So the principle of likes attract likes. So people vote for the person that reflects how they are thinking. So this is inherently a conflict, because if you want a leader to evolve, then this leader needs to start proposing and exploring thoughts which will not be shared by the people that are making the votes. So it's even more complex, and one could say these thinking processes that expose why you are thinking, they should be very helpful for politicians. If you put together two politicians from different parties and you just outline why they are claiming this and why they are claiming that, you actually have a process that allows to combine this, but at the same time this process will be very dangerous for them, because it's not okay for a politician to be shown to be wrong. So that's why they are doing all their thinking locally without exposing to the outside world. That's also, and that's a negative effect of competition in general. Once you start competing, also in industry, what you see happening is that while everybody knows for innovation point of view, knowledge needs to be shared, actually competition causes knowledge not to be shared. It's completely the opposite. So that's a side effect. So competition on one hand can have a beneficial effect, but clearly one of the drawbacks of competition, whether it's political parties or companies in industry, is that you have to protect your knowledge. Actually, out of this, what I want to add as an additional tool to overcome the psychological biases that I mentioned before is actually that you need to map your logic, including all the assumptions. I don't distinguish between norms or paradigms. You're not aware. You have to challenge them all, and the way to challenge this is actually to first map how you normally think, and then to focus really on the assumptions and ask yourself, can this really be true? And this challenging, you need to open it up to the entire community. You should say, actually, one should be able to share a logic, the thinking of logic, and then ask anyone, is anybody agreeing with this way of thinking? If you do it that way, then by concept, you cannot have anchoring or fundamental attribution error or confirmation bias, because you're actually seeking out and checking your assumptions in the broadest possible way. So this is...
Isn't that also dependent on the way how you react upon the responses?
Please?
If you share your ideas or assumptions with other people and they react, maybe you just justify your own assumption again, and then nothing changes. So it's also dependent on the way you deal with the reactions.
Yes. Yes, but inherently, I would say there is always the balance between your normal thinking and we all have the tendency, because we need, from a efficiency point of view, actually we need to be exploiting our knowledge. So in principle, I'm also trying to exploit, I would say, this toolbox, so that's right. But that's why I come up with this case at the end as a verification. But in principle, you need to be aware that the most efficient way to tackle something is through expertise. Expertise is the most efficient. When we grew up as a kid, we didn't know anything, but we learned to speak, to walk, etc. So you learn expertise, and when applying expertise, that's if I have an accountancy problem, I just go to the accountancy. I don't apply Goldbart thinking processes. So you need to have expertise, and whatever expertise has been developed and is available, that's the most efficient. But you need to know when to swap from actually from expertise to problem solving. And what are the indicators? The indicators are tugs of war, blaming, segmentation. These are interesting indicators, and you need to know therefore when to swap. And what I tried to expose in the first part, the boundary of logic, this is something, it's just putting together and you can question, but I claim that actually when you do thinking in a group about a certain problem, you will have a tendency to not question the norms. You can question it, but I have actually an example, and that's the example I gave, which is not in my area, which to me appears to justify. And maybe I come to that example now, because I think it's a good case. I don't know what time...
But can you explain about the eclipse? Because that seems interesting. So how do you eclipse?
Well, the eclipse, it's actually when you have a certain challenge. I take immediately the example that I'm going to present. You have the logic that anti-smoking campaigns reduce the number of lung cancer. That's the reason why anti-smoking campaigns are being organized. So what you do actually is you develop a logic why this is the case. So why are anti-smoking campaigns leading to a reduction in lung cancer? And you're making several assumptions into that. And with the eclipse process, what you're actually doing, I compare it to during the day when the sun is shining, there are no clouds, you cannot see the stars. And that is the reason why you cannot see the stars is because of contrast, because they are there. If you would have a telescope, you could see the stars during the day. And what happens is during an eclipse, when the sun is hidden by the moon, then actually during the day you can also see stars. And the point I want to make clear with this is that actually you cannot see the stars because of a contrast, the matter of contrast. The contrast is too low. With our thinking, it's the same. When we are thinking, we are out of principle of least effort, laziness, we are doing normal thinking. And that's okay. I mean, that's really fine to just think normally. But you have to realize that whenever you enter into a problem situation, then it becomes worthwhile to actually have the trigger that's telling you maybe there is something wrong in my normal thinking. So, and then the eclipse process is the process in which you first really specifically make the drawings of how you are thinking logically. Why is this negative effect happening? What is causing it? And then the more complete you do this, the more assumptions you will have made in this drawing. And then in the eclipse step, you're just forgetting your normal logic and you're focusing on all the assumptions and you're actually checking, could it be wrong? Could this assumption be wrong? And that's what I look into.
I still don't understand what you speak, your normal logic. What is the thing that you eclipse, that you make disappear in order to enhance the contrast for the other things?
When you draw the logic, you have cause-effect logic. What you're making disappear is all the logic. You just focus on the starting points.
Ah, just on the assumptions?
Yes.
It's not that there is one core assumption that you eclipse?
No. You start, you actually...
you eclipse the step of reasoning, the different inference steps,
yes.
And you keep the assumptions?
Yes.
Ah,
okay. Yes.
Because I would first have thought that because you have certain biases, that you take certain assumptions as being so logical that they don't need to be justified, that you would somehow eclipse those assumptions.
Well, this is indeed where there is a huge opportunity, but in principle you actually, any assumptions you have used as a starting point, you should start to investigate, because you don't know at first instance which one might be able to provide you with a breakthrough. Indeed, when you're addressing, and this is the challenge of true problem solving, in innovation, actually it's frequently a lack of knowledge in a certain area, and you can find out several ways to work around. When you would apply it in science, then if a logic is really shared by a very large group, then you would only have few assumptions that you should indeed investigate. The paradigm changes are those few assumptions that are shared by the large group. And the fact that you would have scrutinized the logic with a large group of people would already have overcome thinking errors which are due to the fact that you don't know everything, but somebody else knows some things, and then things would gradually mature. What would remain out of this process are indeed a few key assumptions. So it's essentially focus on all the assumptions, and you're hiding your entire logic thinking.
I want to ask a question.
Yes.
As far as I understand, the whole method that you present is a kind of a debugging process of your rational thinking.
Yes.
Rational thinking, individual or among groups.
Yes.
But at least in social circumstances, most of the problems are not necessarily having to do with logical errors or wrong assumptions, but different value systems that are incompatible. And is there anything that you propose you mentioned two of your examples were actually about political parties. There is a lot of irrational thinking in politics, but basically, even if all parties will be fully debugged in the rational thinking process, they will still disagree about how to do things, because regulating the economy and the free market approach are two incompatible value systems, and one is not better probably better than the other.
Yes.
So,
No, I agree. Okay, but you can criticize me again for being anchoring to this toolbox. But the toolbox will actually point out that the fact that you have these segments, I reverse it away, it's because they're also all making the same, like the Pannenkoek discussion. My claim from the problem-solving toolbox that there is a boundary condition that all of the political parties are agreeing upon, and that is wrong. Actually, today I have quite a good hint of what that wrong assumption is, okay, this is a completely different topic, but I think that what is wrong is the assumption that welfare should come out of income attached to labor. We have seen a lot of discussions also within the ACO group going on. There are a lot of indications into this, but this is the key why today people are being forced to work longer, to have this longer labor, while it's clear that everybody wants to enjoy life more, while it's also clear that attaching this to labor, it's creating a mechanism, it's not supporting the implementation of replacement of labor, because whatever could be automated, you could say it could free up time, but as long as this automation is considered to be taking up jobs from people and therefore leading to loss of income, it's actually preventing this type of innovation. So it's a completely new paradigm, but again, you can criticize this as, okay, it's not clear what such a mechanism should be like. What I'm just indicating as a process in here is that when different segments appear to disagree and they start acting in a zero-sum game way, then this is, from the problem-solving point of view, this should be a trigger to stop arguing about what is right, because then it's a value system discussion. What I claim is actually that there is something which is hidden, like the spelling rule, something which is hidden, assumption that is so ingrained that we are so blind to that we don't even notice it anymore, that should be put into question, and that can actually enlarge the solution area. This is one answer to a solution. The other answer to a solution is something that I experimented with. Problems that are not solved in win-win, and John Nash won the Nobel Prize indicating that actually you should always try to achieve that for stable solutions. My experience is that lead always to blaming. So blaming is a very nice indicator of a local solution, and downgrading of communication. And actually I challenge all of you, but I think I did it also in 2008. Whenever you have an interaction with another person that you have a negative conviction about.
You might have two ideal solutions and not one. That's when you have discussion between two humans, you might have more than one ideal solution.
Yeah, but
everything crumbles.
I want to give an example of how this problem solving affects human relations in a way that actually, when I was CEO, I used it as a design review. That is, whenever you have a negative conviction coming up about another person, then I claim that this negative conviction, you can trace it back to a problem situation which was not dealt with in a win-win solution. And this leads, for instance, in companies between different departments, this leads to a process where one person is going for that person's target, a local optimization, the other person is going for another local target, and if you have actions which cause the other person disadvantage in reaching the target, the other person actually has to counteract, and you get an interaction process which actually supports this negative conviction, which leads to communication breakdown, and which, from problem-solving point of view, actually is caused by the inability to find a win-win solution. And from the problem-solving point of view, what you have to do is to realize this, and therefore to do more effort, to be empathic, to actually consider that the other person is rational, while your reflection from this negative conviction will be that the other person is irrational, and you stop understanding the logic behind the other person, so you stop actually mapping the logic of the other side. And the example that I'm going to give within science is, for me, the exact same pattern. What you see within problem solving is communication breakdown, blaming, and local optimization. And this is all unstable. So it's all not win-win, it's all not targeted anymore to a complete view.
So you think in any situation you can find a kind of a global optimized solution?
Well, but I would say, I think, yes. And I would invite you to read the book of Goldratt, The Choice, where he considers that one of the key obstacles is actually starting to think that there is no solution possible, because then you don't look anymore. So actually, if there is a solution and you're uncertain, you should never abandon there may be a win-win solution.
I agree that the method that you propose is debugging a lot of flaws in the process of communication and logical, and also it might also serve a kind of a noise reduction that will expose the real problems. But
let me come to this example.
I question the power of this toolbox to address real complex problems where you don't have a single...
Yeah, but that's why I presented this example.
Okay.
Because actually it's so, I would say, working on how people are thinking, that even within companies, I can only partially apply the toolbox. It's related to a certain product concept, but of course if you start to segment, you get major changes required. So in any case, in these areas, innovation potential is also always limited because of a lot of boundary conditions. What I thought was that in principle the process I outlined, I started wondering, can it be that this is also applicable within the scientific area, pure science? And I actually had two cases. One of them that I plan to present here. Another one that I've discussed with Clément before, that I also would like to have the opportunity to discuss offline with Francis, which is in the physics area. But this one is, the one that I want to indicate is in healthcare. So it's the logic that I indicated, the challenge that the normal logic behind anti-smoking campaigns expected to reduce the number of victims. I don't know anymore how I came to select this one as a challenge. I recall in the years, early years 2000, that there was a lot of discussion about this and frustration about abandoning smokers from public areas, etc. So a lot of undesirable effects, and for me, a number of undesirable effects and conflicts, pubs that claimed that they were going to reduce their profits, is for me an indicator. Maybe interesting to see whether some norm is at play here. And I was really surprised to find one. And this is the case that I want to present in here.
Victims of what, just by the way?
Number of victims due to smoking. Lung cancer, smokers. Smokers, when you smoke, you're expected to develop lung cancer at a higher probability.
Lung cancer, actually, it's a very rare cause of death.
Not for smokers.
Even for small?
No. It's
Even among all the kinds of cancer, it's one of the...
It's one of the most common ones.
Lung cancer?
Yes.
What I know.
If you're interested, you download the paper that I'm referring to. There's a 700-page report also explaining all the research being done. Okay. And actually, what I found out, and this was, I would say, the absurdity, is that within preventive campaigns, so this is when I applied the Eclipse mode, can I find anything that might lead to the reverse? Can something indicate it's true? And I fell onto the placebo effect. And the placebo effect, I think most of you know, it's actually the concept where if you do a certain act, and normally it's associated with taking a drug that has a certain expectation. If the expectation is that you take a drug and that this drug will cure you, then it appears that in the control group also a significant extent of people cure. This is a scientific given that has been challenged in the past by scientists. Today it's not at all challenged anymore. And today, because of that reason, when you develop a new drug as a pharmaceutical company, you actually have to demonstrate that your drug in double-blind clinical trials is working better than the placebo effect. So that's a given. That's what I mean with placebo is real. Another given is that placebo works in both ways, positive and negative way. What does this mean? This means that the mechanism behind placebo, there are multiple mechanisms behind placebo, but in principle they are gathered under the terms expectation and conditioning. So what is being understood by science is that the placebo effect is a real physical effect which is caused by the expectation and or conditioning. Of course, in the negative way, it's very tough to do research because you cannot set up a research in which you are going to demonstrate that the negative expectation is causing actually health hazards to patients. So there is less research, but all the indications are that placebo effect is real and works two ways. Now, it appears that one does not take this into account when setting up preventive healthcare campaigns. And you can see complete logic equivalent between setting up a healthcare campaign. A smoker, which is seeing on his package smoking kills, and then actually smokes a cigarette, it's quite equivalent to a patient receiving or taking a drug with the expectation told by the doctor, this drug will cure you. So that's the equivalence, and I would say the logic is such that normally you should expect, therefore, that in preventive healthcare campaigns, also due to a placebo effect, there should be actually an increase of number of victims. This is an example of an absurdity. So I know this all sounds absurd, but this is the feeling that you're expected to feel because it's so counter to your intuition. And that's why I consider it a good example. And actually, when I dig into this, there are a lot of symptoms, I would say, associated with it. I claim, and this is an easily verifiable claim, out of this claim I would say, this would imply that because smoking intensity against smokers has really increased in our society over the last 20, 30 years. So what I predict is that look to the risk, and you should see that actually the risk within the smoker community should also have increased. Actually, the first version of the paper that I had sent to Clément, the feedback I got was that, yeah, but okay, I see the logic, but you should have proof. And I was, till then, I was too lazy to find out the proof because I considered I'm not a health expert at all. So it's actually the medical community that should easily be able to say that this logic is flawed or the evidence doesn't support. But the logic is based on their own findings, so that I have real references out of the medical society. Placebo works. It works both ways. So I started looking and. Actually, I found evidence. It's in here. The evidence I found was that indeed lung cancer, according to extensive studies, the lung cancer risk with smokers indeed has increased from the years 60s to the years 80s. Even from 2000 and 2010, I found reference to a study that it increased with women. But especially from the 60s to the 80s, it came to a surprise to the scientists. It was surprising, so it was an anomaly. An anomaly is really a hallmark sign of paradigm change. When you have a certain normal understanding and something is not fitting to this normal understanding, you consider it an anomaly. In the case of lung cancer, this was an anomaly that it had increased because normally...
It had increased from which period to which period?
The 60s to the 80s.
That's too soon for the negative effects.
No, I agree. That's not a claim. But what happened is that actually, when they found this, they were surprised by it. So it was it came unexpected because there was not an increase was not expected. Actually, it was clear that it was not due to air pollution because it could have been attributed, but they didn't see an increase with the non-smokers. So it was clear that the increase was only with the smokers community, and they attributed this. Actually, to what I, in hindsight, call now availability bias. They attributed it to the change in cigarettes. The cigarettes, you have to know that in the years 50, it came known that cigarettes smoking was unhealthy. They had been sitting on this information within these cigarette companies since long, and they had suddenly it exploded through processes by the American government, etc. So it came into the news, and they were really criticized. And so they changed their design. It's in this period that they changed the cigarettes to implement filters. And the filters they integrated in this period, they had as a purpose to reduce the effects of lung cancer, the possibility for lung cancer. So what happened is actually they found out that it increased, and at that time there was a huge discussion because of this process. This is the onset of, I would say, the discussion that smoking was hazardous. And there was a second wave of onset with passive smoking. Passive smoking started to be known to be unhealthy in the years 80. And this has led actually to the separation that we know now, because this is the key justification why now smokers are being banned. It's not because smoking is hazardous to the smokers, but it's because smoking since early 80s is known to be hazardous to non-smokers. Which implies actually, and this is one of my claims, that also since then, since the 80s, you will find out that lung cancer with non-smokers will have increased. Because non-smokers beforehand were not aware of any expectation when they were in the neighborhood of smokers. And since the years 80s, this has changed. So what I claim in here is that lung cancer...
Yeah, but has lung cancer increased since the 1980s to now? Because if your argument would be correct, that's when you would expect most increase, because that's when the campaigns against smoking have become...
The only thing I found back in this report was that with women, but again, I'm not a researcher, and this indicates a bit the problem. When I'm making this outside view, the problem is that I'm not an expert, so I don't have the data, but I would expect health experts to be able to confirm this. It's a very simple prediction.
We should be able to find that in PubMed, if you look for statistics of lung cancer, that's over the decades.
But the problem is that what I have found is these studies are not that simple. Again, it's quite complex. So and what I have found is indeed an increase from the 60s to the 80s. This I found a study. I found another study with women, increase from 2000 and 2010. And what I also see is that in neither case, and this is for me the logic, nobody is considering placebo effect. And that is where I say, for me, the logic is actually much more convincing. There is strong evidence that placebo effect works both ways. Why do they attribute from the 60s to the 80s?
We don't really have evidence that the placebo effect can cause cancer, because nobody has ever done that experiments.
But that's not an experiment. Expectation...
we know that expectation influences the reporting of certain symptoms, but there will be some things like feeling good or feeling tired or not having headache that are pretty vague, that are strongly affected by placebo effect. An effect like dying from lung cancer is a pretty strong effect. That has never been demonstrated to be a result of a placebo effect. We don't know. It may be not.
Well, what I'm saying is that it may be and it may be not. But what I'm seeing is that with lung cancer from 60s to 80s, this is an explanation which based on scientific logic, placebo has been shown to work both ways, positive and negative. There is actually no, I would reverse it. There is no scientific reason. What is the basis to assume that it's not working? There is no basis because nobody is looking at it.
No, but I mean, you can think of thousands of reasons,
No?
and all of those, they have some basis in the sense that there is some hypothesis that might work.
Well,
I mean, to give you another example, why would it increase from the 60s to the 80s? Maybe because people got richer in the 60s and they started to smoke more. Before they couldn't afford to smoke 50 cigarettes a day, maybe afterwards they could.
Yeah. But I agree, and that's why I'm saying I'm just playing, one could say, the clown. I'm just presenting a logic, and it's the experts that need to judge. I'm not the expert, so I'm not even claiming to be the expert. What I'm saying is that I just apply this logic, I start questioning this.
Yeah, but just to understand, who would be the experts here? I mean, if you would show this to a longman, I think you would say, okay, there's so many co-founders here, we may know or not know, cannot say anything about this. So if we have this as an example,
Yes.
what contribution can it make? For what field, for what expert, for which? I don't really get the point. I mean,
Well,
I see the way you structure it,
yes, indeed, but that's a very good question, and that's where you come to with any paradigm change. So what happens is you start questioning a norm, which within the community itself, few people, because of the effect that I indicated in the beginning, nobody considered it their responsibility. Only, and that's somehow the hope when you publish this, only those young scientists that actually see this as a challenge can. But what I claim is actually the challenge propagation mechanism, because it's so absurd, it's limiting the initiative.
But personally, I don't think it's so absurd, the thing you're mentioning, that there's also a placebo effect which is backwards, you could say, or negative. I don't think that's absurd. I mean, in psychology, this is not an absurd claim. Only to prove that this has something to do with the development of lung cancer, that's just another question. So what I would like to know is what would be the next step if this is the statement? Just to understand also
what is being predicted, what is being written in this the paper that's being linked to, is that there are two facets. One is there is the logic, and the logic just says it's known placebo works two ways. And Francis, you are right. In some cases, it's also known with drugs. There are some areas that placebo is known to be more important than in other areas. But this has really already changed over the last 20 years. And what has happened is gradually areas where scientists said, here it cannot play, in those areas it has been shown actually to play. And so what this mechanism says is there's on one hand a logic, and there is the logic assumed behind preventive campaigns that somehow justification is missing. Nobody is even discussing that the placebo effect would be missing, and actually out of this it would be clear that if you want to reduce smoking victims, you should not use smoking kills, but you should just increase prices or do different means. So there is no rule that says you should avoid negative expectation, and this implicitly implies that there is an assumption that it's not playing. And this assumption, I'm just exposing it. That's all I'm doing. I'm just exposing it. And what I'm doing is actually then looking, as I was stimulated by Clément, and I found what I didn't expect, namely that from the 60s to the 80s there is an increase from the 2010. I don't know anything else, but I saw indicators that appear to support this. Furthermore, I also found that hay fever, a little bit the same situation. Hay fever has actually increased, while according to the data, in mid-70s, there were much more pollen in the air. It has decreased up to 2000, and so there's an inverse correlation. And this inverse correlation, this gives rise to certain hypotheses, like it's air pollution, like the hygiene hypothesis, that it's because we are all too clean. But again, I'm asking the question, why is nobody questioning or suggesting that it might be the negative placebo effect? And then I come to this first.
Are you looking at hay fever as separate from the smoking in the sense that there was publicity about hay fever and therefore more people started to feel hay fever?
Yeah, that's the expectation claim. The expectation claim is that when people that are subject or belonging to a certain risk group, when you reinforce the expectation through communication that this act is linked, you're smoking, you're linking this with the expectation, the more you do this, it's proportional to the risk. And actually...
No, wait. The hay fever, do you think that's caused because of anti-smoking campaigns?
No, because of communication around the pollen in the air. Yes. So in general, what I'm saying is that out of this expectation conditioning with drugs, it's a given. Actually, it's a legal implication that when you want to develop a new drug and put it on the market, you have to compare it with placebo. And out of symmetry in logic, you should expect the same in a negative way, and it's not there. But I claim that therefore any communication about the negative expectation, and most health preventive campaigns are using the negative effects to try to stimulate you to avoid them, and claim that they increase within the group at risk, they increase the risk. And so this is something that I predict it's for any cholesterol, obesity, whatever, the more you communicate about the negative expectations, the more they materialize. So it's a very, I would say, scientifically verifiable claim that I'm making. I'm just saying that whatever preventive health care you're doing, you should find an increase. And actually what I'm saying is that the science community will always be surprised. And why will they be surprised? And this has to do with the first bullet. I use it again as demonstration of segmentation, science versus belief. Within the scientific community, there is actually generally a negative attitude towards religion, and I call belief in extension. And this appears to be clarifying all these elements. Why is the placebo effect never considered as an explanation with anomalies? Because it's forgotten. And somehow, one of the recent results, interesting results, by one of the experts in placebo, Fabrizio Benedetti, was the following. So I think most of you know that if you do this double-blind clinical trial test, then in average, placebo effect works, let's say 35%, but it can be up to, depending on what type of, it can be up to 100%, but there's a variety. Let's assume 35%, and the real drug, let's say it works 40%. What Fabrizio Benedetti actually realized, which is a logical consequence from this expectation conditioning theory, is that it plays in both cases. So within the 40%, part of the result should also be because of this expectation conditioning. So if you want to know the real chemical effect, you should find a way to exclude the expectation. And therefore, he has proposed different ways of research. One of them he calls hidden administration. What is hidden administration? It's administration of real drugs while the patient does not know that he gets the real drug. This is ethically a problem, and the reason or the way that they avoid this is by agreeing with the patient, look, you're part of this research, we want to check this, so we will give you the real drug, but we don't tell you when you get it. So within over a period of 1 year, you may get it, so ethically they solve it that way. And what is the result? They see that this drug, which is known to work, really, actually, it's reduced, almost disappears. So let's say it goes from 40% to 5%. Now, why should that be surprising? If you have the comparison 35%, 40%, why should it be surprising? Yet it's accepted by the scientific community as surprising. And that is indication of the fact that somehow this placebo effect, which is called the power of belief, that's the nickname of placebo effect, actually scientists attribute the working to the chemistry. It's a reductionist approach, and they downplay the effect of the mind and the expectation in this. For me, it's a clear proof. All of this fits. It's a paradigm change. Actually, they never considered the placebo effect in preventive healthcare campaigns, and actually, within drugs, they are even surprised when the expectation factor is eliminated, that chemically it appears actually to work so badly. So all of this indicates to me that this is the paradigm change, and the consequence, and with real drugs it's actually known through Benedetti studies. In real drugs, he has written a very good book about this. He's saying, look, it's very important that doctors and people in healthcare they put more attention to the communication with the patient because the effect of a real drug is really, to a large extent, correlated to the interaction between the healthcare provider and the patient. And this is actually known, but somehow it's not taking up.
Well, quite a lot of research is done on that aspect, actually, because I evaluate those researchers, and there are a lot more research done on that. Actually, interdisciplinary, just trying to combine psychological insights with scientific questions. Yeah. So.
And what is the point?
Well, I just said the research is done, so there are some research done on this question, like trying to combine the insights based on, for example, placebo effect and the cause and effect of lung cancer. So yeah.
No.
Just so maybe it's a contribution to you.
Yeah.
You can check it out.
So actually, what in a conclusion I see is that I can see understanding from the segmentation framework that there is a kind of averseness to the deterministic approach to see the chemical effect. And this, once you take this point of view, you see also a lot of, I would say, I call this again symptoms. It's a bit like the spelling rules in hindsight. Suddenly I see that we have too many rules, but before I was not aware. And also in this case, I see a lot of things like there was a video by Richard Dawkins that you can see on the internet where he's interviewing in his always very friendly style somebody from the homeopathic area. And you can feel under the surface that he's ridiculing this. And this, I think, this is a bit the generic attitude within the science community, is a statement that, yeah, but homeopathy, it doesn't work because it's the same like placebo. And the interesting thing is that, okay, this may be right, because, and it may be right that they are putting more emphasis, which is actually Richard Dawkins' view. He concludes, yeah, if every doctor would put so much emphasis on his relation as I have seen in that research institute, then it would be working much more. So he recognizes this intrinsically, but what does not happen is out of this, the conclusion that therefore the placebo phenomenon is a very interesting thing, because if you see from research that it can scale up to 100%, why not invest in research to understand how we can make it work up to 100%? And one uses it just to say homeopathy doesn't work, comparing to placebo, actually downplaying the fact that placebo works, downplaying, which is also seen in the comparison with real drugs when one removes the expectation, then one is surprised. So it's the same downplaying. It's like it doesn't play a role. It's really reductionistic science. And so I make with this case something which fits both the segmentation approach, which is in my view a bit the consequence of the tension between science and belief system on one hand, which even affects scientific reasoning up to a level that there are blind spots which, from a logic point of view, you cannot clarify. Why is one surprised when one removes the expectation that then the working really drops? I mean, from a scientific point of view, you just realize it's the combination of the two. And then you still need not be afraid of the homeopathic effect. On the contrary, you should actually optimize, on one hand, how to stimulate the placebo. And suddenly, and in this paper, I also did this assessment on the real drugs. Real pharmaceutical companies, what they try to do now is they try to minimize the placebo effect, because they want to score better. But if they want to score better by minimizing the placebo effect, what they're actually doing is they're reducing the expectation. So you can imagine that in their drug application procedures, when people get the drugs, if you really believe that it's the chemical, you may be tempted to say, just give them the drugs, don't talk too much, because otherwise you may activate the placebo effect, just minimize it, let's do the chemicals work. But the consequence of that is that actually the expectation goes down, and this would also clarify why they have more and more problems to get their real medicines down, because a large part of the effect is actually the placebo. And they should really develop policies in which both are reinforced.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to know, but I read a research, I had to evaluate it also, that general practitioners who also had a homeopathic background actually had more success with their patients.
Yeah.
And so now they're trying to research the reason why. I think this could be
yeah.
way answering the question. the placebo effect and actually the belief question, I think.
Yes.
And maybe also finding out what's the difference between a general practitioner that does have a homeopathic background and one that doesn't, and maybe they communicate also differently.
I just want to indicate in here, so the key problem with the problem-solving approach that I'm presenting in here is that actually what you find out is almost, I would say, by principle, you start questioning norms that have been the conviction of experts, and you're an outsider. So with this view, actually, I'm an outsider putting questions, and I've tried to get in contact with scientists. But what you find out is because of the absurdity of the claim, and because of the fact that nobody actually wants to be, that's my negative conviction, maybe wrong, really wants to be the victim of a harsh campaign. I feel that there is some, how to say, restraint, no? Some a tendency not to really be too eager to look into this. And my feeling, and that's the experiment that I was referring to, I was planning to send out actually a press release, because I'm only interested in this problem-solving toolbox. I'm not interested in the health cases, actually. I'm more interested in the general consequences in our thinking on how to apply for problems. But what I find is that a generic problem is that because of this toolbox, I now really understand quite well why you need to be a non-expert somehow, because you need to look at it and you're always challenging an assumption onto which an entire structure has been developed that you're questioning, and it's not straightforward to get inside. In this case, with the health policy campaigns, I have the hope that because it's making statements about public health policy, it's not like it's something in the area of physics which is only interesting for physics. This one has real major consequences on public health science, so I have the hope that therefore it may trigger action. But the challenge from my point of view towards the global brain is that this pattern of stigmergy, of making something that somebody else will act upon, I have the feeling that in the area of paradigm changes, it breaks down. Somehow I find that I cannot stimulate experts to react on this. The one that may be able to tell whether I'm completely crazy or not, it's Fabrizio Benedetti. He's a real expert on this placebo effect, both negative, hidden, etc. So I would expect him to be able to confirm this. But I'm making such broad predictions in all areas of preventive campaigns that I assume he can only make a very cautious statement like, yes, the logic may be true, but no, I don't know whether this is really true because I don't see the evidence. And this is a bit the situation which will always be surrounding paradigm changes, because you make something which may have a certain logic attractiveness, but then you still have to prove it. And it's clear I cannot prove it. It's also not to me to prove it. And this is what I want to indicate as obstacles into problem solving for a global brain. I think these two mechanisms, paradigm changes shared by groups on one hand, and the segmentation which actually needs to maintain itself and can be overcome. These are two processes which I believe should be added in order to have a more efficient global brain working. This is more or less the message that...
Just one contribution, maybe it's interesting for you to look into the research that's done on the question whether social apps and media stuff helps to engage people in their own healthcare process. Maybe there are some interesting links here with your problem solving. Also the belief question there is important. The way you can motivate people to take their drug, to follow their therapy. Maybe there's a good example for you to
actually, it's a good idea. What we call a mobilization system. It's a technology that kind of incites people to act if you include the placebo effect in the sense that you create positive expectations. It should work better.
Yeah.
And it should not be difficult to create a positive expectations.
Yeah.
Like the example I gave in my paper, mobilization technologies, was that somebody who wants to lose weight, you have an app that gives all kind of suggestions. But then the app could also have a photo of you, how you would look after you have followed the program and lost 20 kilos.
Yeah.
And that would create kind of a positive expectation and aspiration, and that would motivate you.
But I would, well, on one hand, I'm not really interested in these cases themselves. I'm more interested in the processes that came to these understandings. And also I think that the predictions that come out of this, I mean, it's a very, I would say, absurd prediction to say that any preventive healthcare campaign is increasing the risk within the group. And I'm confident that actually there are a lot of data already available under the nose of the scientists, but they're just not looked at that way. So I would assume that by making such a statement public, that those scientists that actually have the figures under their noses or have access, it's a very easy verification. So this is at verification level. On the other side, I'm working with the logic of the thinking processes. I mean, it must also be very easy to indicate why this logic is flawed. I'm just making two assumptions. Placebo exists and it works two ways. So indicate what is the research, why they do not have to take it into account in preventive healthcare campaigns. I just noticed it's completely absent. And this in itself, for me the logic is strong enough to say it's completely forgotten.
No, but you can ask the question whether they are not choosing between two ills and choosing the lesser ill being if fewer people smoke, then maybe the few that they continue to smoke will get more lung cancer, but there will be less lung cancer overall because more people will stop.
I agree. And this was my first assessment. And first I started to understand, okay, so maybe it's a reduction, but the trade-off is not made. And with a lot of cases like obesity, it's not a matter of reduction, it's all increasing. So it's not a matter of reduction. And you're right, but the trade-off, it's not made. It's not there, and what happens with the trade-off is that you recognize correctly there are two phenomena. One is the decrease in the group, in the risk group, like with smokers, and it's true that in the past there was about 50% of smokers, and now it's about 20%. But it's also true that within the group of 20% now, it's not decreasing anymore. So the efficiency of the campaign is nil. Almost in all European countries, they are now facing with this hardcore of smokers that cannot stop. And what you can say is that because of the increased strength of the negative messages, you're actually strengthening the expectation. This is an expectation if you compare it to drugs. I mean, who is doubting that smoking is killing people? I mean, it's so, you're doubting, but
ironically, because such campaigns are also based on belief,
yes,
they operate optimally. They save those that believe the campaign and kills those that do not believe in it. So.
Yes, but I would say one can make all this type of reasoning, but the fact is that the reasoning is not made. By making the expectation or the preventive campaign, what I claim is like with drugs, you're increasing the risk. So a risk, I would say the same with mine lungs. And what I claim is actually that when you have the first onset of a risk detection, with the expectation is not there, and this is like the real chemical danger. But once, because of that, you start developing policies to avoid it and communicate, etc. What I claim is that you're actually increasing the risk, and we should find a different way. And today, nobody dares to say, "Sorry, everybody, stop smoking or abandon smoking," and actually. The risk of lung cancer is not even anymore in our countries. It's in the developing countries where all these large concerns are now really finding much larger groups to sell their cigarettes to. So the problem is really there and not here. But in our case, I can use the argument that in Western countries, there is no decrease anymore. So the only thing that is happening is an increase in risk. But the question is not even on the table. So Francis, what you're saying, this trade-off, it's right, it's a sensible approach to make. But then you would also conclude that you would only go for this using of the negative messages if there would not be any other round, and you would be more careful with it.
Yeah, I agree that, for example, one thing I would also follow your logic is that positive campaigns will have positive effects. That means if you put, instead of frightening people who are smoking with what will happen if they don't stop smoking, if you would tell them, look how much better you would feel if you would stop smoking, that's the same message, but in a different package,
yes.
that may have more positive effects.
Yes. The question is, you would tackle it differently. And
Yeah.
the criticism that I'm essentially making is that the question is just not even on the table, and I'm fitting the question, the observation that it's not even on the table, and putting it in the general assumption shared within the scientific community is that this expectation is something, it's a disturbance, it doesn't really work, etc. It's like homeopathy. So there is a kind of a downplaying, not a full recognition, despite the enormous amount of scientific evidence. So there's that's the key point. And what is intriguing me, because from pattern point of view, I'm convinced that whatever analysis one would make in languages or in, I mean, it will always be the same pattern, that you're making something of a claim which defies the standard logic which has been the operating paradigm over a longer period, and appears to change everything. And this is paradigm change is frightening. It's also telling that all the experts were wrong somehow, and this is something which nobody within that community wants to, I think, take up the responsibility for. So I have the feeling this is a more general limitation of innovation that needs to be overcome, because there are clear undesirable effects caused by that could be avoided. That's why I call it an experiment. So I plan actually to send out the press release to scientific papers, and I'm wondering whether this will get attention that goes beyond questioning, ridiculing. I'm looking to reach a community that is interested into verifying the specific claims, because I think it makes very strong and easily verifiable claims just by looking to past data. But it's made by a person that has no credibility in that area, because it's not an expert, and it's somehow at the same time initiating a certain crisis, because it's putting all of the current operating processes into question. And at that level, it's completely comparable to innovation in a company. Whenever you are developing a new product in a company, there's also the question what happens to the people that are manufacturing the current product, etc. All of this uncertainty, these are key elements that are characteristic of innovation that, in my view, also apply within the science community.